can all mute yourself,
I'm
if you
going
can
to
actually mute yourselves, so we don't have background interference. So welcome everybody, so many familiar faces and some new ones. My name is Sarah Bullen. I am a literary agent and I'm also the publisher of Diviner Mind. Um, and also a friend of Nicola's. So I have the honor of just guiding you through this conversation with lots of time for questions at the end. I am myself sitting up in Botswana, where you're going to find a lot of the book has taken place. But just my background and really a great excitement from my publishing company, Odyssey Books, to launch Nicola's book as the first under our banner. Um, I have been in publishing for some time, but last year we joined with a larger publishing company really to launch some very important authors that we believe have got something to share with the world around sustainability, around Africa, around inspiration, around critical thinking, around smart thinking. And so this really was the most exciting book to start off with, Diviner Mind. Um, and I have also known Nicola for a very long time. I would almost say 15 years. And I know various parts of her that maybe we'll get into down the line. And I also want to welcome on this call really Ria, Petra, Evelyn, and Cosmin, who invited most of you via the Weaving Wisdom Network or the Systemio organization and really are pulling together these important conversations. And then, of course, our author, Nicola Robins, who is a little bit overwhelmed by the attention and the messages and the support and the feedback from her book, which is quite an extraordinary thing when you launch a book like this in the world, and it's not very surprising. But if you go into LinkedIn, you're going to see one Nicola Robins, and that profile or that persona is going to be the Fulbright scholar, the Yale business graduate, the expert business consultant, senior associate for Cambridge Institute of Sustainable Leadership. 25 years of working with companies in the world of sustainability. If you look at another version of Nicola, you're going to see the diviner, the sangoma, the mother, the wife, and somebody who steps into a very, very different realm. And it's in this book, I think, for the first time that she's outed herself in such a public way and brought together these two parts of herself. So welcome, Nicola, to the conversation.
Thank you, Sarah. Good to be
And
here. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
the very cover of your book poses a very big question, actually, the back cover. What if Africa's knowledge traditions could guide our way? Phew, that's a big one, and one you set about answering in a very, very interesting and in-depth way. And I really am fascinated by the beginning of your book. And the beginning of your book starts with the obligation, right? A whole piece you put in. And as her publisher, this was a very important piece. It starts with a big problem in your mind. How do these secrets that have guided your life and your internal compass, how do you share them with the rest of the world? And you say it took you 20 years to get it right. So how did you navigate this within this book?
It took a long time. So it's probably been about 3 years that I started sort of realizing I was going to do a book. And some of the things are secret, but most of the things are not secret. And so that was quite an important thing to know the difference because Ngoma traditions, which are there are many of them in Southern Africa, they are not written down. So these are oral traditions that go back for a few millennia. And they've never been written down. This is different to many of the traditions in other areas. And so when you've got oral traditions, a lot of the information, the knowledge, the wisdom is going to sit implicitly in how people do things, in relationships between people, and it changes over time. And so my exposure to that kind of knowledge came through obviously working and training in this tradition with Neil Campbell, who I call Pokoje in the book. We asked to be called Pokoje in the book. It means the jackal. And he's a very careful teacher. And he is extremely traditional in his way of teaching and in his way of honoring the systems and the knowledge as well. So it had to be done very carefully. Not because technically you can't just bring the knowledge back. You can write it into a course in some ways. You can create a process that helps people to divine, a lot of people to divine. That's not the indigenous knowledge. It doesn't exist in product. It doesn't exist in process. It exists in relationship. And when we work or when we live and we grow up in a worldview that is far more atomistic, that doesn't look at relationships as much as it looks as things in isolation, it becomes almost impossible. And so, while on the one hand, it's really easy to do an indigenous training and then come back and reinvent yourself as a corporate shaman or, like an ancestral wisdom teacher, that's not that's not the knowledge. That's about you, and that's often about, either your ego or it's extracting the knowledge unintentionally. But extracting the knowledge is a deep problem. It's been going on for hundreds of years, and if we're going to do this with integrity, we have to find a way not to do that. That part is hard.
There's a part in the book in which you write that knowledge is regarded as hot. I found that quite intriguing. Does this link to what you've been saying, that if it goes out in the world, just explain that hotness?
Yeah. So that is a term that would be a translation of how people feel and how people see the language. Not all knowledge is hot. So certain knowledge that is linked to stuff that is deep, stuff that is passed on over time, stuff that didn't just, kind of pop up. It's not insignificant, it's significant knowledge because it has been gestated, it's been moved through patterns and understandings and deep thinking over millennia. That knowledge is hot. And it is always contextual. In other words, some knowledge that is hot in this place might be a little bit different to the knowledge that is hot in that place. And so that's why I said you've got to develop this sort of embodied sense, this ability to tell what is hot knowledge. And if you've got a good teacher, they're going to help you. And you're going to make mistakes, and then they're going to help you a little bit more, right? But hot means to pass it on lightly is a dangerous act, both for you, for the people you pass it to, and the knowledge system itself. And there are laws about passing on knowledge. There are, again, many of them are implicit laws. And there's a word that I was taught by Neil here, is the word of Kutsana, which refers to the concept of the knowledge being orphaned. So Kutsana literally means orphaned. And this is, we might say, it's a traditional law of knowledge, which says when we cut knowledge off from that longer lineage of where it comes from, what we do, we are orphaning the knowledge and we put it out into the world in a way that can give rise to danger and many, many problems. And we might not know it at the time, but things will start to go wrong somewhere, at some point, at some scale. And to be able to track that when the knowledge has been orphaned from those who gave rise through its lineage to that knowledge itself becomes almost impossible.
Now, I know many of the people here have read the book and some haven't, so I don't want to give too much away, but the book has an incredibly gripping trajectory and journey. Um, and now you're sitting with the knowledge, but when we meet you in the beginning of the book, you are young, you're ambitious, you're a sustainability consultant, you're auditing a diamond mine, and as you tell us in the book, you hear the voice of the mountain speak to you. And this sets off a chain of events, which maybe some people will call a mental health breakdown, but various interpretations came into it. Tell us what happened in that space you were in after you flew back from Australia.
After the mine spoke to me, or sorry, the mine, the mountain, after the mountain spoke to me and told me that it was a sacred site. Um, Something had happened to my body, but I had forgotten. I had forgotten that had happened. I mean, for me, as you describe, I was really, ambitious, very kind of straight. I never had imaginary friends. I don't have a kind of a new age interest. I hadn't, and so it was impossible. What had just happened was utterly impossible. And these things happen apparently in a very split second, where it happened, the mind interpreted it in some way, but then immediately corrected itself because it could not be possible. So I'd forgotten. I didn't know it happened. All I knew was I felt a little bit strange. And I carried on. It was a 2 week engagement, doing a lot of auditing, in kind of 38, 40-degree heat in northwestern Australia. And I found it very difficult the whole way through. I just wanted to go home because I did not feel comfortable at all. And I got home and my body started to do strange things. We could put it down to panic attacks. We could describe it as rising anxieties. We can describe it as shaking, seeing weird things, breaking out in dots and sort of colored patches over particular parts of my body, and just not feeling stable. And so I was absolutely confused. I assumed, as I think most people in my position would, that this was as a result of stress. All of this traveling around the world and being a consultant and all of that stuff. And I was quite young and frankly a little bit out of my depth in terms of consulting. I didn't have enough experience to be a consultant, and this was the sort of nature of sustainability, right? No, it was still an emerging discipline and an emerging practice. And so those of us who had just a smattering of training got to do some very interesting things in quite a rapid time. So I was just feeling like I was falling apart and feeling like I was stressed. And the sorts of things one does when one's stressed in my kind of culture, is to go and have a few massages, or to take some rescue remedy, Buck's rescue remedy, to like, just settle down so you can go and do the next job. But it wasn't working, and it wasn't working, and it wasn't working, and things were definitely getting worse, and things were definitely getting weirder. And it was getting harder and harder to pull off an ability to have a grounded conversation with people when, the walls start moving in weird ways and patterns start interfering in your conversations. Not recommended.
That part of the book, and I think this is one of the reasons that many people who have written reviews or have just got hold of us have said, I almost can't read the whole thing at once. And this has been a common comment from
Mm.
people because it's maybe it's so hot, maybe it's so intense that there's so much going on there that people have read a little bit at a time and then come back almost tiptoed back because it really reads like a little bit of a thriller. Um,
A
and
lot
just to
thanks to you, Sarah, actually, because that was the narrative. Like, it has to be a story. So, yes, thank you.
we need stories. We need these wonderful stories, and this really is a sensational story. What eventually made you choose between, let's call it, I'm going to use these little fingers because you're very careful with wording in the book, Western psychology versus an indigenous solution.
Mm.
What was that like?
So I did eventually go off to a psychologist. I waited for about 3 months and I thought, okay, I clearly need more help than massage. And it was useful. I'd never been to a psychotherapist before, and she was a psychodynamic therapist. She was really cool. Um, and we got talking. It was not my thing. I grew up in a time in South Africa, which was a time of war. It was a time when people were increasingly aware of a war, but if you grew up in what we call the sort of white leafy suburbs, right, the sort of liberal suburbs where a lot of white people in South Africa lived, you could have not not had any experience of war whatsoever. And yet the war was just a little bit away, just maybe a kilometer away. It was war. And that was a very disconcerting space. And when you became aware of it, and I was only aware of it from the age of 9, just how weird it was and how extraordinarily dissociated South Africa was. This was the height of apartheid, and it was the height of this growing mass resistance. This was in the mid 70s. when I was 9 years old. And what happens is when you get a sudden shock and you realize that the country and the reality that you've lived in, for 9 years, my parents were broadly speaking liberals, right? And they didn't support apartheid and they didn't like the South African government and they supported the sort of progressive liberal PFP, the Progressive Federal Party. But if anyone grows up in a liberal household or a neoliberal household these days, you might become aware that liberals can say one thing and then bring about entirely the opposite thing through their actions, often unintentionally. So liberalism itself and this way of living in this system can contribute to this very sort of dissociated, weird, not real way of being. And so I think you may perhaps, why did I switch? Why did I make that switch? And it was a hard decision at the time. I think I was predisposed. I mean, I think I was so not trusting of the reality that seemed apparent to me that I had to stick with an intuition. And the intuition was that the solution that was coming forward from the Western psychodynamic model, while very reasonable in that frame, and essentially it was to go on very heavy antidepressants, and if that didn't work, on antipsychotics. It was a very medicated option. That solution sat very uncomfortably in my body. I could rationalize it. It could make sense. I've never been the kind of person who does any kind of drugs, actually. I'm a bit sort of straight. So I just knew I couldn't do that. And so I can go into a conversation with a psychotherapist and I was really respectful and she respected me. And then we held this tension and I just said, no, no. And I was getting worse. And I think she was waiting for the point where I could say, okay, no, you're right. I mean, I'm really screwed up. So but it didn't come. And fortunately, living in South Africa, and this is the upside of living in a country which was at war, is that options are available. I live in a country where there's genuinely a system. Yes, it's been quite radically diminished and vilified and made illegal in some respects. The system has been horribly, essentially brutalized in some ways by what has happened to it over the last 500 years. However, it has survived. It is a highly adaptive system, and I'm talking about the Ngoma system. It's an indigenous knowledge system. It's been highly adapted. It's blended, so it's mixed in some areas with Christianity. It's currently mixing rather well, it seems, with New Age, New Age culture. So it's a system that survives, and it operates through lineages. And it felt so grounded, and it felt so real, and it felt like a real option for me. And so while it was a difficult choice, intuitively, I think my body had made it sort of a year or two ago before, yeah. And possibly because I was, in a way predisposed through the process of growing up in that particular place.
And there's a beautiful scene, and so you're in Botswana. You haven't quite yet decided, I don't think, if you were going to dive into this process called Twasa, which is this very intense, rigorous training. And Kodwe O'Neill says to you, you say something like, and I don't have it in front of me, can you cure me? And he says, we can make it livable to entertain all these parts of yourself. And that seemed to be this huge relief that there was some system, as you say, indigenous knowledge that could contain all this chaos that was going on.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, and he, I mean, Neil, so now we're talking about him when he's on the call, but anyway, we'll do that. Neil is a very perceptive person. This is one of the things you get when you train as a diviner and then you work in that space within a lineage for years and years and years and many, many decades. Um, so he would have worked out very, very quickly because I'd only met him, about a day before. He would have worked out pretty much who I was um, from a point of view of my relationship to this possible training I was going to go on. And by the way, just for people who don't know, the training as a diviner is the cure for the illness I had. So the training and the cure. So you got to kind of let go of these stark categories where, like, is this a training or a cure? It's both at the same time. Um, and so I think what he did, which was very, very smart, was he didn't overpromise. He didn't say, this is going to cure you for sure. What does a cure look like? There is a very clear understanding that this sickness, this Okutwase is also the name of the sickness, a sickness of calling. There is a lot of clarity that the sickness manifests in different ways. It is reliably cured or, fixed, if you like, but cured, through this process. But how it happens is completely unique to a given context, a given person. Okay, so he didn't say, you are going to fly. It's going to be amazing. You're going to go home and everything's going to be much better than it was before, and you're going to be 120. He didn't say that. He said, maybe all we can hope for is that you get to live life in a more relaxed way. Because I was spending my time sweating and shaking. If anyone who's had a panic attack, just think of it as an almost constant panic attack. That's eventually how it came to. And he said, perhaps all you can hope for is the chance to live life in a more relaxed way. And I like people who don't overpromise and who routinely overdeliver. And that's what happened. And I just said, okay, if you can look me in the face and say, this is going to cost me a hell of a lot of time, a hell of a lot of effort, and a hell of a lot of money, but you can say, don't expect too much. So, I like that.
So obviously, a lot of the training brings out in the word ancestors. And I know on this call, there's a lot of people of the ancestors,
Mm.
people who work with ancestors. I'm looking at all of the constellation people here smiling. Earlier, Evelyn showed us her ancestors sitting behind her on the wall. So there's many people here who speak this language.
Mm.
And your training, your Okutwasa, you're working with ancestors, but you also bring in a concept which I wanted to raise, and it's a very interesting one in the book of war ancestors. So maybe just in general to just speak a little bit about ancestors, and then in particular these war ancestors, and really what that is.
Mm. So ancestors, on one hand, are people who have died, and they are people who, for ourselves, they're our biological ancestors. So it's, grandmother and grandfather and great grandmother. These are, I think, a pretty clear and quite common understanding of ancestors. Why do Southern African traditions, or many of them at least, put quite a lot of emphasis on the idea of ancestors? It is because there is a belief and an understanding and an experience that our ancestors still are with us, still impact our lives, even though they are dead, even though they are not there physically, they have an impact that runs. And this is not unknown in many, many traditions, including very, very sort of, Christian traditions. They have, the sins of the father are visited on the sons and all of those things. So there is this very strong understanding of ancestors. And the way we understand it, will be depending on our culture. So perhaps if you grew up in this North Atlantic or Western way of thinking about the world, your ancestors will really literally just be gran, and grandpa and all of those things. You won't get sort of deep about it unless you're a constellator, or whatever. And if you grow up in an African culture, it's just going to be very, very different. There will be a sense viscerally of grandmother pitching up at unexpected times in ways that make you feel very good or very uncomfortable. This is a very useful signal if we're trying to make decisions where things are complex, where things are changing and perhaps challenging us. And there are different ways of referring to ancestors, and it's very nuanced in these indigenous traditions. It's much more complex. So, many Southern African traditions might talk about shades, seeing ancestors as shades. It's the shade of something that comes upon us. There are different ways of understanding, but very, very beautiful if you want to delve into anthropology or if you have traditional friends. But war ancestors are another kettle of fish in many respects because when we have ancestors that are our biological ancestors, we can, generally speaking, take for granted that their interests and our interests are similar. In other words, grandmother would want me to do well. Grandfather would want me to do well. And there's a sense that when we feel into these grandparents and when we feel them coming as ancestors and we feel their presence, there's a kind of an ease if we've kind of solved all the, the kind of entanglements that can happen. War ancestors are not our biological ancestors. They are ancestors that emerge through mortal combat. They are ancestors that come about because we have war. And there is a lot of war. And I think today we know that there's going to be more. Right? So ancestors that emerge in mortal conflict recognize that death and the act of death can result in a profound entanglement between the identities of the people involved in that contact in that conflict. So you could be a descendant of a victim, someone who was killed in a battle, and you could feel interconnect. You could feel a connection, an entanglement with the perpetrator of that crime or the person who killed. You may be the perpetrator, or you may be the descendant of a perpetrator, and you could feel the victim, right? In your being, in your kind of around you. And this is immensely complex because you don't really know. It's not definite, but you can just feel it. And again, people who constellate will have a good sense of what I'm saying. But if we don't go into these ways of working, which understand identity as far more collective than we would typically in our culture, this is very difficult to imagine. It sounds weird. It sounds made up. But what we can see it as is a signal that there is unfinished business. There is a signal that there's been disturbance and it has not yet been settled. And so these war ancestors, and they're called in the Zulu culture, amadlozi akuhlasela. It literally means invading ancestors. These started to pitch up as afflictions in people in Southern Africa only about 200 years ago, which is when we started to see the expansion of regional wars, the rise of empires, the Zulu Empire in particular, and then also potentially colonial wars that were happening at the same time. So a much greater disruption, a much bigger war that continued on and on. I mean, the Xhosa people held off the British colonial army for 100 years. 100 years of war. And so the depth of disruption that came about as a result of this colonial invasion gave rise to a new experience of ancestor and a necessarily new or in a really new and innovative way to work with them. Because the old rituals that allowed you to settle grandfather and grandmother or other ancestors that wanted you to perhaps be a diviner or perhaps do some particular form of agriculture, whatever, the old rituals that settled that and made that possible no longer worked. And so that really kind of kicked off this very innovative way of how do we work with war ancestors? And one of the ways was this training of being a diviner yourself.
So, as we're chatting, I'm sure all of you in the room, as we call it, the Zoom room, the writing room, have got questions. Um, and maybe thoughts are sparking in your mind. And maybe that is, what does it mean for me if my grandfather was in the war? And how does this impact my life? And how do I work with it? I mean, I can imagine that, there's things going on and also people who are not born or living in Southern Africa.
Mm.
So please pop them in the chat. We're going to actually ask you some of the questions directly, and maybe we'll take a gap in a little bit before we move into what we call the business. How does this all relate to business? But please, if you have a question for now that you are being sparked with, pop it in the chat and we can check with Nicola as to where that is. And I'm just checking on our time. Okay, we're good. So please, I'm going to keep an eye on that at the moment. So, where were we at? This is very interesting, this conversation and this nuance that keeps happening with you, in which you deepen a process, which is an Indigenous knowledge process. And the whole way through the book, and probably the whole way through your life, you've got the mind of a scientist working, and so you're in it. You're deep in it, but you're also intellectualizing and trying to understand what's going on in the writing process of the book. And how was that for you? You know, finding yourself in this very old tradition, out of your control, but your brain is thinking, how is this working? Is this how you operate? And how is it?
Yeah, and it was, I think the process of writing the book was very helpful because I can say very lightly that this is an oral tradition and nothing's written down. And that's okay. We can sort of pass it on in stories. This is a radical, radical proposition for someone who grew up, or for any of us who grew up, knowing that if we could write things down, we would be able to understand them better. We would know what categories they fit in, and it could be really neat. And we would kind of learn that, and it would inform our decisions and it would inform our actions. This is a very, very kind of comforting thing and a comforting way of making decisions about what we're doing, what we're writing, how we're understanding life. If we can write it down, it's really, really helpful. So when we are working with knowledge that has never been written down, we are we are we are bound to be floundering at some level if this is not the way we have we have come to think, if this is not the way we like to work. And so there is always this sense of the only part of you that really knows, unless your teacher is sitting right next door, which is not going to be all the time, the only part of you that really knows is deep, deep, deep inside you. It is an embodied, highly intuitive sense that for many years, even after your training, it doesn't just pop away. This is a deeply, deeply sort of entrained way of thinking that doesn't know implicitly whether this is okay or not to say, whether, this means, a metaphorical thing or an actual thing. And it's probably going to be both and a little bit in between. This is a very messy, very unclear, but very rich set of traditions and ideas. And so when you bring that very linear, nicely compartmentalized scientific mind, when you know that a thing either exists or doesn't, or you know the thing exists and where it fits in relation to other things, and you're suddenly working with knowledge that is extremely fluid and dangerous if you get it wrong, right? Potentially. Um, it's it's like being in the sea and you're not sure you can swim, but there's only one way to do it, right? You kind of get thrown in, and then you start to work it out. And for me, the scientist was extremely useful because what we can't do is sort of just go with our intuition. Because how do we know it's right? Right. I mean, the ancestors can be useful and the ancestors can be pulling kind of a fast one on us. We don't really know. So we don't just say, oh, my body feels this, because we've now interpreted some signal, and our ability to interpret it will be most likely impacted by our life experience. It will tell us how we want to interpret it often. And so we get into that space of you can go this way and it's probably useful and pretty much true, and you can go that way and it's delusional. How do you know the difference? And so that requires a scientist's discernment. And so you're not just shrugging and saying, oh, anything goes, let's just follow the flow and, let's just put our trust in the ancestors and let's just go with spirit. Nah, it's a combination of having access to that in a deeply embodied way. And ideally, collectively, you want to access others as well. And at the same time, being extraordinarily disciplined and extraordinarily discerning on whether that in fact takes us in the right direction. And we never know for sure, but we take a first step very carefully and then we test. And then we take another step and we test. And that is the process, which is for me very scientific. It doesn't make any assumptions about what is true, but it tests on what is really working through a pragmatic approach that is informed by lots of people's experiences. So this shared narrative. That for me is absolutely science. And so I love that process of being able to activate and lean into an intuitive part of myself, but yet not let go of a very, very rigorous and analytical scientist.
It makes me think there's a section, I think it's a chapter called Working with Spirits or something, in which you interrogating Neil or Pokojwe and asking them, do spirits exist and what are they? And you're unpacking them and you just come to a conclusion in that place that the answer to these questions is less important than cultivating a relationship with these unseen things and actually putting them to work.
Mm.
I really love that. But for those of you in the room, as you know, I'm Nicola's publisher. I was also at points her editor in the book. But this attitude she has of I don't know the answer is really humble and it's beautiful. And as a publisher, it was quite frustrating because she's been asked to talk about many a thing, and she said, "Well, I don't know. I don't think I can. I'm not an expert." And I've had to say, well, you know, you actually are. Now you are a little bit of an expert because you've not only done this for 20 years, but you've actually taken this massive thing and written it down. So I see that in the way you operate, in that staying in that, I don't know the answer, we're watching, we're also analyzing, and I'm certain that that is part of how the diviner mind process works in organizations. And so maybe this is our bridge, and then maybe this is my question, and then we're just gonna open up to the floor, is what is this bridge with business? Because there's quite a fraught part of the book where you come back, you've graduated, and I'm not going to walk everybody through it because it really is a jaw-dropping experience what her training she goes through. But then you have to integrate back into life, back to your husband, back to work. You've got this knowledge, you want to share it, and it's just landing on, deaf ears in organizations. Um, what was
Mm.
that like for you? And how did that?
I just want to talk and respond a little bit to your point about expertise, because
Mm.
I'm not an Indigenous knowledge expert. I can't be. I've got such a narrow slice and a very, in a way, my own experience is so narrow. And I don't come from an Indigenous culture. Well, I mean, way back, I guess, Celtic, which is the Indigenous fringe of Great Britain, but I'm not from a Southern African Indigenous culture or an African Indigenous culture. But I have expertise, and if I put that in a nutshell, it is I'm an expert in how extraordinarily difficult it is for people who grow up in the North Atlantic culture or the Western way of thinking to learn from Indigenous knowledge. I have deep expertise in that because I've been failing so resolutely at it for 20 years. Well, I did fail in it. Failure is for me not a problem at all. And it's certainly not a problem in traditional context and indigenous context. Failure is absolutely how we learn. And sharing stories of failure are a far quicker way to learn and share knowledge than sharing stories of our success. Because very often success is very contextual. It's very limited to a particular person in a particular time doing things in a particular way for a particular purpose. And failure becomes a far broader lesson, which kind of puts up red flags and triggers one's discernment. So failure is very, very helpful. And so I speak a lot about that. But what is the bridge into business? I mean, in a way, learning from failure is a pretty good bridge in itself. So I think business is a bit allergic to failure, but if they used failure more often, I think they could probably both advance better and develop a little more humility. But the bridge came when I realized that Indigenous knowledge had pitched up despite myself. I had long given up trying to do it because I couldn't find a way to do it with integrity. I mean, in South Africa, and many of you will know the concept of Ubuntu. It is very deeply, involved, or it's deeply entrenched in a way in many businesses. And it's a very beautiful concept. It emerged into the mainstream in the mid-90s in South Africa during that transition to democracy. But it was also entirely possible because it's quite a general concept. It was entirely possible for people to translate it or interpret it in many different ways. And so Ubuntu is there, and it's on the sort of extremely not useful side, I suppose. It just becomes the Ubuntu room, or you go on an Ubuntu leadership retreat, which is still a exactly the same, but it's got a new name and it feels a bit African, or I mean, Ubuntu is also used to sell washing powder and many, many funeral policies. It's a big thing, and it's a known kind of sales tactic in South Africa. So that was the extreme. There are also areas where it's been very well used, and very well applied. At the same time, for me, it wasn't a good bridge. Because Ubuntu has now become an area of extraordinary scholarship. There are people who really, really understand it, but not in a not only in a sort of practical on the ground indigenous sense, but more in an academic sense. And that's not my game at all. But I eventually I got the sense that it was there because I had been trying to understand why my very well-intended efforts to begin to show people that there are patterns of possibility when you innovate, and we can see those patterns if we look with this diviner mind. We can see those patterns. And I was showing people these patterns. I was saying, look, here are the patterns. And at some point, I do tell the story in detail, but at some point I was like showing like 100 variables, and then I would highlight the patterns on the wall in different colors and say, can you see the patterns? Because it's like obvious. I can see the patterns. Why can't you? And and people just looking at me like, you know, who is this person trying to inform innovation? And it was only when I really began to learn a little bit about complexity science, in particular the what's called the naturalizing sense-making school of complexity science that was started by Dave Snowden. And I suddenly realized what the problem was. People can't get knowledge from experts when the system is complex. So if the system is complex, it's not about some expert showing you the patterns that they can see. If the system is complex, which means it's very interconnected, to be able to be a useful person, to be able to help and move forward, you have to encourage sense making that brings on everyone's fundamental and very much innate ability to see patterns in data. And so when I started realizing that it was my own expert that was getting in the way of people being able to work and find and access this inner diviner mind and this collective diviner mind, which can happen in a group, I suddenly realized where I had gone badly wrong. And all of that came from a training that pushed my sense of expertise and a commitment to try and use that expertise in support of complex transition, in support of democracy in South Africa. I could not escape that persona. But eventually, I guess, the indigenous knowledge system, kind of ground it down. And again, it sounds very clear cut, but it's not. Because on some level, a diviner will work as an expert. On some level, if you go back in time, diviners were less about an expert giving advice to a particular person and more about a person able to facilitate a kind of a group input. Divination socially was a group or collective act. It was a highly social act. It wasn't a one-to-one transaction. And so I guess I started to feel into that and put away that expert, which is very hard work for us, for me at least.
Right. There are some fabulous questions in the chat. And I thought to ask you to ask them directly. So, Kathleen, I wondered if you wanted to ask yours. I'm going to go around a little bit. If you want to unmute yourself, and then maybe Evelyn has a wonderful question. Kathleen, I can't see anybody because we can only see each other, Nicola and I. Hello.
Hi,
I
Sarah.
can't.
I'm Nicola.
So we
Thanks.
could even untap spotlight or whatever that,
Yeah, we can
whatever,
unspotlight. That'll be
so we
nice.
can
I'm not
see
Yeah.
everybody.
on camera at the
Um,
moment, but I will ask my question. Thanks. I just
okay.
wanted to, I've actually got two questions, and the one is off the back of what Nicola has just said around the ability for people within complex organizations to sense make for themselves. And I think that that's really one of the reasons why I've been working with Nicola for a long time. And I very, very much value our relationship and the knowledge that she shares because of this, in the sense that it doesn't create that typical consultant dependent relationship where forevermore you're seeking the external kind of advice from a consultant around what's going on for you organizationally. There's a capacity building that happens that's quite solid and true and authentic in working with her. So I wanted to ask, I do worry, Nicola, and this is obviously like I've been around the block in terms of working for various different organizations. Increasingly, we're living in more and more complex times, and organizations are a microcosm of obviously that level of complexity. There is a proclivity for senior executives and board to seek external help in navigating complexity. And this is often to their own detriment, right? And we know this. I mean, we've had lots of conversations around this. I think but the reasons as to that are very legitimate. Or like the way in which I understand it is that execs often feel alienated, that they're not able to sing outside of what is considered to be the hymn sheet of that particular exco or board. And if they are, they're alienated. Often toxic work cultures prevail. There's a lot of systemic issues. So how do we get our executives and our board members to be comfortable with one, complexity, and two, with building that capacity to sense make internally versus constantly seeking the help of the big five, which honestly just gets us nowhere? That's my
Great.
first
Thank
question.
you for that.
Sorry, you can now ask another question. My next question, which was in the chat, is how can companies hold epistemic justice and performance accountability together without romanticizing Indigenous knowledge or reducing Indigenous knowledge to just another managerial tool?
Mm.
Great.
Thank you. Those are both great questions. And Kathleen and I have indeed gone back many years. So how do we get execs comfortable? I don't think that's our job, really. I think that a little bit of discomfort is useful. And I think that, the problem with which stops many executives and many executive committees from really grappling with complexity and uncertainty in a useful way lies outside of their level of comfort. It lies in a system that's much bigger than that, over which we have little power and little control. Generally, if we're coming from the outside, either as a consultant or from the inside as a sustainability lead or sustainability practitioner, they have an ability naturally as executives to use their intuition. They didn't get there without intuition. Every executive has it. He or she would not necessarily do that consciously, but it's all there. So that level of comfort for me will only emerge when their discomfort with reality becomes great enough to equal the balance. And so this is going to potentially take a long time. And this is why, for me, the problem is structural and the problem is systemic, is that it takes a long time for people to begin to pull out of those personas. Like my expert persona, they have executive personas. It takes an extraordinary long time. Is it going to happen individually? Well, it's not one or the other. But I think as we see organizations grappling more with deeply ethical issues, with issues that cannot be answered easily, for which there is not one right answer, we're going to see perhaps an inclination to a little more humility and a little more smart, really. Because I do see companies increasingly saying, that 10, 20 million that we spent on this sort of high-end consultant was a waste of time. And I think this is going to put pressure on the entire management consulting industry. And I think that's long overdue.
Mm.
There's a lot we could say about that, but I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay.
Just to talk about romanticization, this is to some degree inevitable as as the whole idea of learning from Indigenous knowledge becomes more mainstream, as it is becoming. And again, we're going into the state of kind of desperate grasping, like, oh my goodness, it's really bad, and what's going to help us? And ooh, maybe this stuff will help us. There is a degree to which it is very, very hard for those of us in these North Atlantic or Western cultures to look at a system and not see a possible product, a possible method. When we start looking at them deeply, we start feeling overwhelmed, right? It's oh gosh, there's rather a lot here, and you know, if it was written down, it would be easier, but it's not written down, and it's all different. And as soon as I engage it, it seems to be it doesn't really work in this so it gets really, really hard. And when we're out of our comfort zone, which is which is going to happen because to reach into Indigenous knowledge, we come to the edges of our paradigm. So the North Atlantic paradigm doesn't stretch very well into relational ways of knowing. It's now got very rocky, it's got very uncomfortable, it's not making sense anymore. And immediately what happens is our defenses will say, I'm sure we can cut and splice and dice it in a useful way so that I can go back to that comfort zone of thinking I can probably get a handle on this. And as soon as we go into that, we have opened the door for not just romanticization, we have opened the door for cultural appropriation and every other version of how non-Indigenous people have decided to use, extract, bring forward, often in a very well-intended way. We are going to do it. And we have to say, to stay alert to the fact that not only is it possible, but it is likely. We have to stay alert to the place we really messed up, the problem when we did it, because we will have done it. And if we can look long enough and hard enough and be honest enough to admit it, we open a tiny space for learning. And I think that's where it lies. And that's why I said earlier, we learn from mistakes. We learn from failure a lot better than we learn from success. Because I can right now go and reinvent myself as a corporate shaman, as I said, and I'll be very successful. But I will fail and I will fail and I will fail. And I will give the right words. And I will even probably convince a whole lot of people that I'm not romanticizing this stuff and I'm not culturally appropriating the stuff. But somewhere, in some point, in some way, I will be. And that's my integrity. That that must be a constant light and a constant guide to say, nah, that's not good enough. Not after 500 years of vilification and destruction and outright banning. That's not enough.
Fantastic. And I'm keeping a little eye on the time because there were two different emails, and the one said we ending at half past the hour, and the one said at the top of this hour. So maybe we bring things to a tight little quick conclusion, and then we'll see who has different dates in their diary. And I know that Ria wants to remind some of her Weaving Wisdom network and the Symbio network of a broader invitation to join Nicola in a longer discussion about the implications of this and applications of this.
So Sarah, if I know I sort of feel like now I've been going on for long answers, but I'm really okay to stay for, 10 or 15 minutes after the hour if people want
So
to.
maybe we say at the top of the hour, those who dropping off, drop off, and we'll keep going until a quarter past the hour.
Mm.
And then also to keep your questions quite succinct. And I'm going to, and maybe where you are from as well when you unmute yourself. And Evelyn, you had a question, so maybe we move to you.
All right. Hi, I'm from Belgium, staying north of Antwerp at this moment. I have two questions. One was more a childish curiosity. In the book, you write about spirits that guide you, and I was just wondering, do spirits are spirits very close to everyone? I mean, and then I mean other spirits than ancestors. That was yeah, just a curiosity, and how do they show up with people who don't have this predisposition for becoming a Sangoma? And then I had another question related to our ancestors, realizing or looking at organizations also as a greater intelligence. How do our ancestors show up, and how, yeah, or is it only something that is close to the founder? And but still wondering, how do they show up in, or maybe they don't. Just curiosity from my part. Yeah.
So I'll jump onto the question about spirits. How do they show up? I don't know. And again, I'm not trying to be overly humble here. It's just it's really hard to say. Especially again, for me, I don't have a culture, I don't come from a culture that works with spirits, where if you come from a culture that is animist and where spirits are present always in everything, potentially in, even in a rock, even in a mountain, even in a person, even in you, then it's really simple. You don't really need to think about spirits because they just are. And so what happens in a culture where you don't have that, and you start to feel things that really can't be explained by your rational science, but that are undeniable in respect of your experience, your lived experience of reality. And it's not just, I feel a little tingling in my tummy, or, oh my goodness, I've got three geckos walking towards me at the same time. This gets very weird. And what would we say? Well, that's a weird coincidence, right? But how do they show up? It could be in many, many ways. And for me, the idea and the concept of spirits is not to say they exist, they show up in this way, they show up in that way. The concept of spirits for me is one that opens into a relational space of what exists between you and some experience of reality. What is that thing in between? If you get into complexity science, I link it a little bit to the concept of affordance. What is offered to you relationally through this connection that appears to have been made, that you cannot nail down into absolute certainty, but that you, with a level of integrity, cannot honestly deny? What happens? And that is a journey. And that is a way of living that I think, for the most part, has been beaten out of us in North Atlantic cultures for many, many hundreds of years. And is it still in our body? Well, of course, because our bodies are very old and our bodies are much deeper in terms of their understanding of this innate wisdom and this innate knowing. But our minds are, and our kind of rational scientific minds that have been highly schooled over centuries, are not easily able to go there and hold the ambiguity of what really working with spirits requires. Of course, if we could do that with spirits, we would probably be more able to navigate complex transition, because it also requires us to hold a level of not knowing and yet act, right, with eyes wide open, without needing certainty, because there will not be certainty until there is. And that is often in retrospect. You only realize out afterwards, I know why I wrote this book. But meanwhile, you just suddenly woke up one day and said, I'm going to write a book. Oh, shit, I don't know if that helps. Maybe it does, but whatever. You can take from that.
Okay, fabulous. So
The
any
question of war
question?
ancestors.
Oh,
Hmm?
sorry, I jumped in before you answered the War Ancestors one.
No,
But
no,
anybody else who has a question, put your little hand up, the little virtual hand, and then I'll see you and we'll
yeah, that'll be good.
shuffle
So
you
again,
around, please.
I mean, for me, my understanding of war ancestors, which came through this particular Fonto lineage of Ngoma, is an understanding that is not specific to organizations. So I don't have, in a way, an organizational frame to put that understanding of war ancestors into. I mean, if I look at South Africa and I look at the fact that South Africa and South African organizations many were very deeply involved with the apartheid state, in sustaining the apartheid state, in supporting the apartheid state in ways that were deeply problematic and included death and included really brutal and horrible things. And I'm going back sort of to the 60s in particular. And some organizations have this in their lineage, where they benefited from the apartheid state's action. Now, I think this maybe is a correlate of, or, this may reenact that pattern of war ancestors, but it's not something I've seen applied to organizations at all. It's rather applied to particular people within whom those war ancestors appear to wake up. Okay, and that's again a very difficult concept, and I do try and explain it a little in the book, but the idea is that spirits can come to reside in our bodies through exposure to events, for example, mortal combat, through death, or even through walking across an old battlefield. And a battlefield could be a township in South Africa. You could be drinking the water from a stream that ran through that old battlefield, and you can get something. Something can, as we say, sort of wake up inside you. And so it's not as if these ancestors jump into you. It's more that the experience of disturbance and potentially trauma is sitting there in the environment, and it actually impacts you in a way because of this particular sensitivity. So in short, I don't really know how to bring it into organizations, except to say that when they become present, they will generally reveal themselves. And it is our discernment as facilitators to say, I think that has something to do with war. And sadly, we might need to do that more often going forward, I suspect.
I may read out a question from Petra, unless you want to ask it. That sort of links to that. I really like that. It says, Petra, what lesson can be learned from your experience with Western healthcare? And I'm assuming, Petra, you're also speaking about mental health, right? Or in
Yes.
general?
Yes. No, from mental health, because in the book you describe your experience and then go to the business of sustainability and broader. And the question set with me reading it, is
Thank
there
you. I mean, and again, I wanted to avoid these comfortable dichotomies, which say, Western psychotherapy just doesn't know, and it can't do this stuff. And of course, the indigenous people know how to do it. This is not useful, because there are instances where psychotherapy and psychodynamic approaches are very useful, very, very useful. And who knows? I mean, maybe if I stayed with the medication, maybe we can't talk about that because I didn't do it. So it's a counterfactual. It is hidden. However, I would say if I'm going to try and take out a little lesson, it is to say that I think psychotherapy, and perhaps maybe more broadly Western medicine, is very good at diagnosing and prescribing and curing illnesses that have the same cause, that express in the same way, and that can be attributed in a fairly linear way, a pathway that you can actually write down, put a name on, and then put in, the DSM, the manual of mental illnesses. And they do very well because they know again and again, they've tried it, they've done the experiments, and this is very useful. But when the cause of a particular sickness is more complex, when a sickness displays or represents itself in a completely different way, because it arises from a set of conditions and realities that has absolutely nothing obviously in common, and you can only do that in pattern, then I would say it's going to struggle. And that's because so much of the Western healthcare system is essentially a huge industry. And it is an industry that needs to scale. And industries that need to scale need to have templates that say, this goes wrong, do that. Now, this is a not because you've got doctors who are bad or doctors that want to do bad work. It's a system that is far bigger than the human intent. So yes, there are practitioners and therapists that work effectively with that system, but I can say it's really hard. It's as hard as taking Indigenous knowledge into the world of business, because the whole system is disposed to pop out simple cures for simple problems. And when it gets less simple and more uncertain, we're in deep water. And I don't think it has sufficient skill. And I don't think it probably has a skill, but I don't think it has sufficient humility to bring those skills through effectively.
Well, with that, we are
And I could be wrong.
we have come to the end, I think, and I just wanted to allow a few seconds to thank Nicola for showing up. I'm going to ask her while I'm chatting if she can rummage up her Amazon link, because and drop it in the chat. Of course, your publisher should have all of these on hand, but I don't right now. Sorry about that. I was looking frantic for it. Amazon is a very difficult thing to navigate, and I do recommend you. There it is. Somebody kindly has dropped it. Please order the paperback. This is actually a book you probably don't want on Kindle. You're going to do like I did, and so many people, they're underlining it. I have a feeling it could down the line be a teaching guide. It's so robust.
Take a lot to South Africa, by the way. So if you're in South Africa, it's going to be cheaper.
Take a lot as if you're in South Africa. Otherwise, Amazon paperback. I can see Petra's got one in his hand. Peter, yeah, kissing it. That's a good. We like to see that. And then, and Petra, please take a screenshot. Actually, I'm about to. Actually, all hold up your books. I'm going to take a
you guys.
Yes. There we go. And then I'm going to just hand to Ria, or was it Evelyn, who wanted to just speak about the last 3 minutes before we end the meeting, about your next invitation to join Nicola in a deeper conversation.
It's okay for me, Sarah. Thank you.
Fantastic. So thank you, everybody, for joining. You will get your invitations via email. Thank you for giving up your Saturday. There's some beautiful questions in the chat. Some people have answered some questions. And please, you can find Nicola on divinermind.com. Is it?
Yeah, you can.
Diviner Mind. And as she reminds us, don't Google the name on Amazon, because it comes up as Divine Mind. So rather go under her name and you'll find it. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to chatting further. Judy, I see you there.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.